This is the LibertyCon 33 panel on home generation and off-grid power, continuing the topics we've been covering over, I can't remember how many years, about alternate energy resources and electrical grid modernization activities. I'm David Bogen, and I've been in the power industry for 40 years and have various experiences and a lot of information to share. Stefan or Greg, who goes next?
Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, well, my name's Greg Eden. I've been working in the field of aviation telecommunications for the last 20 years. And as a part of that, we install quite a lot of solar power, especially since I'm doing most of my work in the third world.
Hi, I'm Steve Simmons. I'm a retired Navy nuclear submarine electrician, 21 years on active duty. For the last 18 years, I've been working for Newport News Shipbuilding. I'm building the submarines for other people to drive in circles. And I am currently embarked on building my retirement home in the mountains of Tennessee, which is going to be an off-grid solar and off-grid water collection and filtration system. So this is kind of right in my wheelhouse right at this moment.
Okay, so let's kind of talk about what are we going to be talking about. So what is home generation? When we're talking about home generation, we're talking about producing energy at the location of consumption. And some of the infrastructure that's required for home generation is solar power, could be wind, could be gasoline, diesel, or natural gas generators. And some of these generators are direct generation, and other ones are types they call backup generation. And to add flexibility to systems, you've got to have some type of way of storing power for when you can't produce it. And that's typically with batteries. Greg, what else do you want to say about home type generation or generation at the location of use?
Well, the main thing you've got to do is first figure out what you want to do, and what is going to be the most efficient means of generating power in your location. If you're living somewhere with very bad sunlight, solar power is not going to be particularly efficient. If you're living somewhere with very little wind power is also going to be not very efficient. The first thing you have to do is define the parameters of what you are trying to power, how much equipment, how many hours a day it needs to be powered. And then you have to look at the options that you have for generating power in the location you want that power to be. In some cases, you will have more than one source of power available. In other locations, there may only be one power source that is viable. So the first thing to do is if you're looking at off-grid power generation, is to look at, first of all, the sources of generation.
And
Greg, are you there?
Power that you have available, and secondly, look at what you want to achieve. Are you hearing me?
Yes, sir. We
broke
hear
up
you.
a little bit.
And then let's not go in that home generation falls directly into off-grid power also. And off-grid, when they say that, it means you're really not connected to a utility. You're not being backstood or have available energy coming into your premise or your house via electrical wires. And it really has a lot of the same sources for energy. Stephen, you're building something off grid right now. What are some of the things that you're seeing that
Well,
are innovative in that area versus things that are typically just done for backup power for houses?
exactly what Greg said before. It's a question of looking around and see what resources you have, and then generate value out of the resources that you already have rather than looking for something new. I have no running water on my property that I'm building on, so water generation wouldn't be really an option because I'd have to find a way to divert some water into it. I also don't have a big drop in height, so water power again wouldn't give me a lot of power. I have a lot of sunlight because I have a property that slopes upward from front to back, north to south, which means that I've got several south-facing hills without a lot of trees on them. So that gives me a lot of ability to collect solar power. That just got to get it collected and then route it to the parts of the property where I'm actually going to use it. I don't have a lot of wind because it's kind of a sheltered valley.
Okay.
If I were up further on, higher up on the mountains, then I'd be talking more wind and water and less solar.
Okay. One of the common components between either backup power and off-grid power is some way of producing energy in advance of when you need it. How important is having some type of storage available for these two different solutions for providing home power that is not dependent on the grid?
Well, anything that's dependent on wind or water is dependent on, well, wind or solar, not so much water, is dependent on when the wind happens to be blowing and when the sun happens to be shining. For the winter half of the year, for my house in Tennessee, I'm going to be collecting the energy during the daytime, but using it to heat the house at night primarily. I'm not going to need a lot during the day because I've got light from the sun, and I don't need the heat during the day. So the battery shifts the power from when it's available to when it's needed. And the battery could be anything. For the large amounts of power that we're talking about for a home, generally you're talking a chemical battery. In some cases, your energy storage could be a big flyweight spinning really fast, and we'll get energy back from it later. That's not really practical for home use, though.
Greg?
Yeah. Again, it's the same thing. You've got to look at what is practical, and you've also got to look as he said, in regards to what you're going to be using the power that you generate for. And that will also determine what type of generation you require. If you're looking at something where you want to live the whole year in that house, you have to come up with a solution that is going to be both efficient but will generate large amounts of power for your whole house. But if you want to, for example, power a holiday home for 3 weekends a year, your best bet is probably just to get a little portable gas or diesel powered generator, as you see in the photo here, because a solar system or wind generation or water generation system will be uneconomical compared to the amount of use you're going to get out of it over that period of time. But for holiday homes, you do have the advantage that over a period of time, while you're not living in the house, for example, with a solar power system, if you've got a big enough battery bank, you can just have 1 or 2 little solar panels and charge up your batteries over a period of days or weeks just for those 1 or 2 days when you're going to be in the holiday house. So again, it's a case of balancing your options, balancing your needs, and balancing your costs and efficiencies.
Right.
And this is a picture really of showing a backup system that somebody designed when the power goes out on their house,
Right.
primarily to give them an alternate feed to their refrigerators and their freezers, and maybe a couple lights in the house. But this is typically installed where these sources, you could unplug them and plug them into an alternate source, because if you went synchronized with the grid and you had this plugged in, you could easily cause a lot of damage to your equipment and to the utilities equipment in a case like this. And if the utility found out about it, they'd be looking at you for compensation. So typically when a person puts this type of stuff in, things have to be unplugged and plugged back in on these dedicated circuits that they have wired into the house for this one.
Or have a transfer switch.
Or transfer switch, which we'll get to a little bit later.
Yeah. But also a generator like this is also very useful when you're talking about wind power or solar power, because it can be used as a backup means of charging your batteries if you get a situation where you have, for example, a heavy overcast and you have several days without good sunlight, or you have several days of calm air and your wind generation unit isn't kicking in. So you can use something like this as a backup to your primary source of power, whether that is the national grid or whether you're using solar, wind, water, whatever. It can be used to either provide extra power at peak load or as a way of charging up your batteries if you come into a period of low generation.
Stephen, are you putting in some type of gas, diesel, propane type of alternate backup on your off-grid place to
Not at first.
through periods?
Not at first, because at first we're going to be in what Greg described earlier with we're only going to be there periodically because we're still going to have our day jobs here in Virginia. We're only going to be up in Tennessee overseeing this as we get ready to get the retirement house built. So we're going to throw in a little tiny cottage so that we don't have to waste money on hotels, and it'll have a minimal solar system. But as Greg said, we're going to have a big battery and a small collector because there'll be time between visits. Once it becomes a permanent occupation, then yeah, we're probably going to be adding some kind of gas-powered backup.
Okay. Now, this is a solar backup system that one of our LibertyCon families recently installed on their house up in the hills in Tennessee, just to cover the periods of time when the utility they're on disconnects them from the power sources, either through the hot summers or through icy conditions in the winter. So what
or when the weather disconnects them.
Say again?
Or when the weather disconnects them.
Or when the weather disconnects them. So what we're looking here is the solar array that was put on their housetop. And this is their collector. Like Stephen and Greg's been saying, it's a fairly small collector because they're not using this every day. This is only used in times of emergency. And we briefly mentioned having some type of transfer switch that they put in. And this is the transfer switch that was put in when they had this installed. And as you can tell, Generac was the company that put this in. Generac is better known for gas backup systems for houses than solar, but they're also doing solar. And they have a very nice transfer panel that the utilities like, because as long as there is live power on the transmission line or the distribution line coming to your house, this system will not allow you to transfer your load to your backup system. Or if it does, it opens up a breaker that is connected to the utility side and disconnects the utility. So, Greg, you have a lot of experiences with types of controllers for power grids and for backups data sources. What should people know about the importance of this type of controller and why they really need to have one installed?
Okay. There are several things that you have to take into consideration for this. I mean, at the moment, as I'm sitting here, I'm running on a 40 kVA diesel generator. That I don't know if you guys can hear it in the background. But over here where I am, our mains power has failed more often than it's working. So we're running on a diesel generator between 12 and 16 hours a day most days. And all we have for that is we have a simple A-B switching system where we switch it one way, we're getting fed power from the mains. We switch it the other way, we're getting power fed from the generator set. It's impossible for the generator and the mains power to be connected together. But regulations in different parts of the world differ quite drastically, and most of them require some sort of an automatic isolation, so that if and many systems, generator systems, actually run with auto starting systems and also have automatic changeover switching. So you can do this by an automatic system, as we see in the picture here. It can be a simple switch, but one of the big problems, if you do this wrong, and this is especially important in grid-tied systems, where you're not storing electricity, but any electricity that you generate from your solar panels is fed back into the grid, is you need a special type of switch. They're called an anti-islanding switch, which detects if the main power fails and disconnects your system from the grid. Otherwise, your poor little solar panels on top of your house are suddenly trying to supply your entire neighborhood, and sparks and smoke and things like that tend to ensue quite rapidly.
Right.
Right. But the best advice I can give for these type of switches is to talk to your local utility. They generally have regulations on how this has to be done.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
Here in the United States, about 30 years ago, when the United States government was controlled by people who believed that legislation could make pi equal to 3, we passed a national law requiring all utilities to offer what they call net metering, where your home wind power, solar power, whatever, could be connected in parallel with the utility, and when you're using less than you generate, and could draw from the utility when you're using more than you generate at night, for example. And that's a really wonderful idea passed by people who have never touched a wire in their lives before. But in engineering terms, it's really, really hard. And unfortunately, again, we passed it as a national law and then left it to the various states and the various individual utilities to figure out how to make that work.
Yes.
So if you're going to have a grid connected system with a backup, you must talk to a technician at your utility in advance to figure out how that's going to work where you are.
And that's the reason most backup systems that have been installed historically are dead throw over types, where they can't come online if you're still connected, or if they come online when they're still connected, they're really not providing any feed until you actually transfer your load to them systems to show the utility, I'm not in parallel with you. I got something, but there's no way I could generate back into your system if I'm
In
using.
theory, everywhere in the United States, I can't speak for anywhere else in the world. In theory, everywhere in the United States, they are supposed to offer you the opportunity to put your system in parallel with theirs and have power flow in either direction at any given moment. In reality, I've seen too many things. I've seen the magic smoke leak out of too many wires.
Yes.
I don't like that. I don't like that idea.
Okay.
Yeah. This is a case where connectivity thing.
Yeah. And I didn't have a good picture of a combined system, but this one here is showing a small 500 watt wind generator installed along with some solar panels. So, and wind is actually cheaper to put up than solar. In residential installs, the biggest problem there is you have to get that wind generator high enough in altitude in order to get to where the wind's blowing more or less unobstructed.
Or in some cases, low enough that it won't blow off the pole.
Okay, good point.
The valley where I grew up in upstate New York, was that part of upstate New York was shaped by glaciers. So the valleys are U-shaped and very long and generally fairly straight or gently curving. And once the wind starts blowing in those valleys, it never stops.
Yep.
My old man looked into the idea of getting some windmill generators back in 1978 when the Carter administration was big on trying to get some alternative energy going. And we determined there wasn't one on the market we could use because we had too much wind.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, that is actually a very important consideration in wind power, because with wind generators, they operate efficiently over a fairly narrow range of wind speeds. So you've got to make sure that you have enough wind to generate some power, but not so much wind that that it overspeeds or overcooks the generation unit. Most of the bigger units actually have various systems of either flexible blades that when the wind's blowing harder, they flex so they're not spinning so fast. Or some of the bigger systems have auto furling blades like you see on the big commercial wind generation sites.
And one of the things that is of concern is that there are regulations in place for installing wind in a residential area. And you have to have a yard that is large enough, because most of the zoning ordinance says if you install wind and it falls down, it has to stay on your property and not fall onto your neighbor's property. So when you look at that from a distance perspective, if you got a tower that's 50, 60 feet up in the air, that means you have to have a radius around that tower that's all your own property equal to that height. So that gets you into having a fairly large property if you're going to use wind, unless you can roof mount it like what is shown in this picture. Greg, this is one of the solar installs that was put in out in your neck of the woods, I believe, for some small scale instrumentation in the field for picking up in the system, but you've also done some wind generation out that way. Are there
personally myself, I haven't done any wind, no.
Oh, you haven't done any wind? Okay, I thought you had.
Yeah, we're living in a part of the world where it's sunny just 365 days a year. So wind generation is solar fits, but the example of a very one we've installed on a rural airport. All customers do it, providing light up the wind planes. That's all. It's a small, but it does all of facet. But the largest, it has batteries, it has charge regulator, and it controlling feature that turning the lights on. Example, it's a system.
Yeah, and
again, this that we install systems in at a very little or what's so we own a battery, and is that the whole
Unfortunately, Greg, you're breaking up really bad right now. It's hard to follow you.
Yeah.
Okay. The internet wasn't so great, but controller, this system on the that is wind sensor along the runway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And here's a solar array installed. Is this a residence or a business here?
This is actually it's actually a government installation.
Oh, okay.
For it's to run a communications system for one of the maritime agencies here that is in control of the shipping going up and down the Niger River. And even though it's in a major town, the power there is so poor that to run all the communications equipment that we had to install, we installed a solar system with battery backup and an inverter.
Okay. Right now is maybe a good time to address this. When installing these off-grid systems, whether it's a commercial environment, a residential environment, a government environment, is there really any difference in what you do, or is it just a matter of scale?
It is purely a matter of scale. You need to fit the size of the system to the size of what you want to achieve. With this system, though, because it is a critical communications system, we installed a little bit more solar and a bigger battery bank just to give ourselves a higher system reliability and system availability number. So that, for example, this has 48 hours of battery backup built into it. So that even if we get a couple of days of little or no sun, we have enough storage to still keep running the system. Similarly, we've got extra solar panels so that when we do get sun, we can bring the batteries up quicker, ready for the next time we have a shortfall in supply.
Okay. Steve, how about you? You're going in with the system. How do you determine how much of a system do you need when you're planning for your off-grid retirement home?
All right. You need to do 3 separate calculations, and each of them is vitally important. First, you have to figure out how much energy, not power, energy you expect to use on the average day at the worst time of the year. Your refrigerator, most refrigerators, regardless of size, run right around their Energy Star rating is going to be right around 300 to 320 kilowatt hours per year. That translates to about a kilowatt hour per day. If you're using electrical heat, you got to figure out how much you're using and how many hours a day it's going to be running. If you're using electrical air conditioning, how many hours a day is it going to be running, and how much does it use when it's running? And then you add all that up, and you say on the average day, this house is going to need 2 or 3 or 5 or 20 kilowatt hours per day for my expected usage. That's the size that you have to have for your collection system. I have to collect more than I'm going to use on my average day at the worst time of the year.
Okay.
Your second calculation is how much am I going to use at my peak momentary usage? If the air conditioning is on and the refrigerator has cycled on and I'm using the microwave and I've got something in the oven, what's my peak power? Because that's going to determine your wiring. And then your third calculation is how reliable is my energy source? I'm going to live in the mountains of Tennessee, which means that I can expect snowstorms in the winter, which means I'm going to have at some point a whole day when the blizzard's going on and I can't get out there and clean off the solar panels during the day. And even if I could, there's clouds, there's no real power coming in. So I need to have enough battery to get me through that storm until the next sunny day.
Okay. Okay. Good. That's all good information. So the 10 tons of air conditioning I have in my house that during the Texas summer typically runs about 20 hours a day is probably not a good thing to put on a off-grid house.
Well, on the other hand, if you live in a place where you have that much heat load, you live in a place where you also have that much solar power incumbent insulation onto your house. Right? Sure. Living in the mountains of Tennessee, where I'm more worried about the snowy days in the winter, I have less solar power coming in, and I'm worried about it being interrupted by snow on top of the collectors. So I've got a different equation than you have in Texas.
True. Greg, what were you going to say?
I didn't actually have too much for that point, but this is a good point. Is that some of the biggest consumers in any solar system is heating and cooling, and those are the ones that you have to take account of. If you're trying to use a solar system in the winter to heat your house, you're going to run into big challenges.
Yes.
Similarly, if you're going to run a big air conditioning system, you're going to need a lot of solar panels. In fact, this photo that's on the screen is a particularly good one for demonstrating this. This is a meteorological station at an airport, and we have a lot of solar power there. Just to run the few instruments that you see in the lower picture, but also a couple of other larger instruments off to one side. The thing is that those instruments in themselves use very little power. The total power consumption of those instruments is on average less than 100 watts. And I know you're looking at that big array of solar panels
and you're saying that that's 1/3 of one of those panels.
Yeah. The problem is that because a number of those instruments are optical, we need to keep lenses clean, which means we need anti-condensation heaters and lens blowers. And those lens blowers and anti-condensation heaters, although they're not running 24 hours a day, when they're all on at the same time, they're pulling 3 kilowatts. So, so again, our biggest consumption is in heating and blowing. Yeah. So you need one of the largest costs in off-grid power is running heating and cooling. And in fact, in some systems, that's 80% of the power generation. Your TV and so on doesn't really use a lot.
Okay. Now, one of the things we've talked about so far is that there's various types of controllers that are available, especially when you're talking solar, which is really the most common type of off-grid systems available, and actually becoming one of the more common ones for backup powers for houses also. And one of the things you need is some type of controller that's installed that manages the installations, converters, and all that. This is a fairly nice commercial unit that you're seeing here that is doing voltage control and regulation control and all that for your batteries charging systems. It does not have to be this fancy or anything like that for a DIY one. I don't really have a picture of a DIY one right now, but I've seen them just mounted various components on a sheet of plywood, and that's what they use. What do you want to say about battery conditioning systems?
All right, what I'm looking at installing up in Tennessee, and I'm actually going to be doing that installation next month, is 5 pieces. One is the solar array, which is going to be up on the hillside, and mine is going to be arranged so that I can adjust it over time, over the seasons of the year, to maximize the input so that I can have fewer panels, because the panels are expensive. That's going to come in through a charge controller similar to this, and that's going to feed the battery bank to keep the battery bank charged. And then the inverter will run off of the battery bank. If the batteries are full, then the power from the charge controller is going to flow straight through to the inverter. When the sun stops running, it'll run off the batteries. And then the inverter will go to the power panel to distribute to the various buildings that need power.
Okay. Greg?
There's an optional 6th component, which typically are fairly expensive. They're nice to have, they're not required, where you can remotely monitor the state of charge of your battery and your battery system's performance.
Okay. But there is another important consideration, is that this unit here only charges your battery. And one of the big problems that a lot of people get with solar systems is they install a lot of solar panels, they get a nice big charge controller, they hook it up to their batteries, and then they cook their batteries because the charge regulator, charge controller doesn't know how big your battery bank is.
Okay. So you have to tune your system.
Secondly, if you connect an inverter directly off of your battery, the charge controller doesn't know how much power they're using. Yeah. The best systems have a communications bus on them. Yeah. So that the charge controller and the inverter and the battery bank are all talking to each other over a bus cable. Normally it uses a type of CAN bus arrangement, so that the inverter knows how much power it's got available. The charge controller knows how much the inverter is using, and it knows how much it's putting into the batteries. So you don't get a situation where when you're not using any battery power, say the house is in, the car controller continues to try and fill up your batteries with power. And then the next thing you know, your batteries are all cooked and failed because they've been overcharged.
Yes.
Consequently, if the charge controller doesn't know there's an inverter there, it starts generating power. It generates as much power as it thinks your batteries need, but you're using it faster than it can charge the batteries. So you end up, even though you've got good sun, you end up having power going to waste because the charge controller thinks the battery is full, whereas the inverter is chewing all your power, and you end up with a system that thinks you've got full batteries, and your batteries are actually flat.
Yep.
So you need to think about how you're going to control and monitor your system so that everything is in balance, or at least talking to each other. The more modern charge controllers are have automatic regulation, so they will actually try and get more power out of your solar panels if your demand is higher. But you need some way of, on a small system, if you just want to charge a couple of batteries just to keep a little portable fridge and a couple of lights burning at your country cabin on the weekend, you don't need that much control. But if you're spending a lot of money on an off-grid system for a house, and the two biggest costs in a solar system or an off-grid system is your generation source, i.e. solar panels, and your storage, which is the batteries. If you start burning out your batteries, that becomes a very expensive proposition if you have to replace your batteries every 6 months because you burnt them out.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Greg's completely right there. I'm looking at real numbers for the house that I'm putting in Tennessee, and I'm looking at an upfront cost of $5,000-ish, of which $2,000 are the solar panels and $2,000 are the batteries, and then $1,000 for everything else, including the cables.
But are all inverters equal? Let's look, because the inverter is where
absolutely not
DC connects to the house. So are all of them equal? Does it really make a difference which one I buy?
Well, it makes a difference depending on what you're doing and what you want. There's a young, like mid-20ish, maybe 28-year-old engineer who has a brilliant YouTube series on do-it-yourself solar collection and small, emphasize small, home solar systems. Very geeky kid, but he does a brilliant job of talking about a dozen different inverters and why this one that costs $20 is not as good as this one that costs $400, but maybe this one that costs $120 is better than both. So if you're really serious about getting into this, you should find that guy on YouTube.
Okay.
I don't remember his name though. I'm sorry, Greg, you were talking. I talked over you.
No, I wasn't talking. I was just nodding my head. But the most important thing you can do if you're going to spend the money on an off-grid power system, whatever your means, do your research. Yeah, it is not as simple as a lot of people want to make out. There are a lot of products out there. Some of them are simpler than others. Some of them are more expensive than others. But the overriding thing you should be looking for is that your system is fit for purpose. It will do what you want it to do.
Yep. And we did mention briefly that there are various monitoring devices out there. Some are very basic and some get very fancy, because you could do your monitoring with just an analog dial meter if you need to, if you want to walk out to where it is. Digital meters or even Wi-Fi enabled monitoring systems. So if you want to really know what's going on, having some way of visualizing it is very beneficial.
Yeah, you can get a device that looks very much like this, that is only local, and you could then go get a cheap internet connected camera to remote this over to your house if your house is away from your solar array, and this would be about $100, $80. Or you can get one that has pretty much the same stuff, but has this really cool, we can put it on your Wi-Fi, it has Bluetooth, and you can spend $800 for the same information.
Yep.
And it depends on your installation as to whether that difference is worth it to you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, we keep talking about battery storages and all that. And I'm going to ask this question because this is a 1 megawatt battery install. Is this something I'm going to want to put on my house? This
Hell
is the
no.
size of a tractor trailer.
Well, you're not going to want it in the house. You're going to want it near the house so that if it goes bad, your house doesn't burn down. I'm looking at probably 4 to start with, but scalable up as I add more things at the retirement compound. 4 lithium hydroxide batteries, or lithium iron oxide batteries rather. But I'm not going to have anything like that at any point because it's only a house.
Well, and this is enough to power 20 or actually 200 homes.
Right.
This actually has a 5-ton air conditioner on top of it to keep the batteries cool enough that they don't overheat. So yes, this is definitely an overbuild. So how do I know when I have the optimal amount of batteries for my off-grid install or my backup system?
Well, in my opinion, Greg's is going to be different because he's done professional installs, and I'm talking home. You start with a grid connected system, and you try to live on your batteries, and you see if you have enough, or if you suck them flat too often. And if you keep sucking them flat, then you buy some more batteries and you add them in. But you rig your system so that it's scalable, and you can add another batch of batteries in parallel until you get the performance you want. That is not optimum from a cost perspective because buying in bulk is cheaper, and you have to time your purchases for when Congress is giving you tax breaks. There's a tax break this year that expires this year. There's nothing in line for next year. And that's a big consideration because it's 22% of that $5,000 I'm planning to spend. That's a non-trivial consideration. Greg's going to have a different answer because he does professional installs instead of individual houses.
Well, it's not so much the case of professional installs. It's the fact that the installations I'm doing are for a different purpose. But basically what I do is I start with, as you said earlier, that calculation. How much power do I need? And decide battery bank system, a solar array, or whatever. You have to, and then because these are systems, we top it up or whatever. We to get an overproduction so that we don't run out. But that, of course, adds extra cost and extra complexity to the system.
Right.
So in a home installation, that may not be feasible or economical.
Well, I was going to ask on that one. Everything has some type of mortality rate to it. So should I, when I'm trying to figure out and do the planning, should I figure out so much overage, like I want to install 20% more than what I would think to cover for that mortality? So as a unit fails, I still have what I need till I could get that unit replaced. So should I plan on something like that, that I do want to really oversize it a little bit just to handle for some of these conditions?
Again, that's a question of what you're powering. If what you're powering is your house and your biggest concern is, I don't want the stuff in the freezer to melt, then if I have a problem, I can crank up my little Honda generator, my very portable handheld Honda generator, and I can keep that freezer running while I go out and buy more batteries or whatever it is I need. So if that's your concern, then don't spend thousands of dollars you don't need to spend until you know you need to spend them. If you're building something that is the communications for the capital city of Niger, then maybe you need a little overkill because they still need to be able to talk to the UN when they need to. Greg?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's you have to look at how often your system can fail and then build around it. I normally, when I'm calculating a system, I calculate about 20% over my consumption, and then I add in enough batteries to give me 48 hours of backup if we have a day without sun. But that is not feasible for a residential installation, especially when, as you do, you have a little backup generator that you can always plug in to keep your essentials running if you need them to.
Okay.
You know, you guys need to wrap it up, right?
Yes,
Sorry.
I just looked at the clock myself, and we're getting close.
Greg and I talk too much. Sorry about that.
That's good. And it gives the editor something to work on. Here is an example of a water well. Being up in the mountains, if you have a creek bed that's year-round or anything like that, and the ordinances locally will let you divert power, this is a way of getting the energy you need without having to have a lot of storage. And this is an example of something that was built or planned to be built that almost anybody with a very basic mechanical set of skills could put together fairly easily.
If you've got the water, use the water. Oh my gosh. Because water flows when the wind's blowing and when it's not.
And here's one
when
that's
it's raining
actually
and when it's not.
This is an overhead sluice, and they're actually more efficient in power transfer than the underwater version. And like Stephen says, if the water's there, use it. So these are good ways of getting off the solar and good alternatives for off-grid installs. They are not good alternatives for backup systems, even though they could be used for one. They're really not the optimal solution there because they're running all the time, and you're going to want to make use of that power. And Greg, you want to talk about this one a little bit?
Well, this is actually one I found online. It's a little solution that a guy in Austria actually came up with. But these things, they're called a Palton Wheel. It's a type of water turbine. Basically, that nozzle that you see at the bottom left there just shoots out a jet of water, which hits the little cups on the system, and you can get a lot of power generation out of quite a relatively low flow rate of water. However, you do need a fairly good height from where you're collecting the water from until it gets to that jet, because it needs a fair amount of power. You need to make one of these work in any way efficiently. You need a minimum of 6 or 7 meters, about 20 feet of head. But you can generate more power if you have enough water. You can generate more power by adding in a couple of extra nozzles, so that you're firing in from, say, 3 or 4 different directions.
Neat. Okay. Did a quick, as we finish up, I want to cover a few resources available. And as you're looking out at stuff, there's a ton more than what's on here. These are just the ones that are primarily hit a lot. One of the grandfather books that started this up and was called Living on 12 Volts with Ample Power. Ample Power was a company that actually got into off-grid systems and backup power resources, and produced one of the first books on the topic. It's out there. It's not available as an ebook, but it's back there. And then there's a couple others that do home or emergency backup. This is just one of the more popular ones that I threw up there. And then for the longest period of time, there was a magazine series out there called Home Power Magazine. It's out of publication right now, but their archives are available online for free, and anybody can download. And it is still today considered one of the best reference archives for backup power or off-grid solutions. They have a ton of information out there that's available, including a series of articles they did on hydrogen cell power generation that was home-built DIY type environments. And then there's a ton of web resources and all that. Everything from governmental sites to commercial sites to hobby sites. You can find information almost anywhere on this topic that is very beneficial. And like Stephen was saying, there's even a YouTube channel that is presenting information, and there's several out there, really.
There's a lot of information out there. There are a lot of companies out there. There is a lot of good equipment out there, but there is also a lot of rubbish trying to be sold as good quality equipment. You have to look at it critically. And the thing is when you're dealing with electrics, especially high power electrics, saving $5 or $10 here or there does very little if it burns your house down.
Right.
So,
right. I don't really have anything in resources, but I would like to hijack things for 30 seconds because this is LibertyCon. If your goal is to make things environmentally friendly, then nothing we've said here is what you want. What you want is to go buy nuclear power from the plant that Uncle Timmy built. If your goal is liberty, then this panel was for you.